Prof. Tan Tai Yong will chair this session, and Prof. Tan is the president of Yale-NUS College, as well as the deputy chairman of the Institute of South Asian Studies. Over to you, Prof.
Thank you, Sitara. And thank you, Minister, for that very comprehensive and insightful presentation, emphasizing infrastructure as an area of growth, but it's not just old-fashioned infrastructure, but smarter and greener infrastructure, and highlighting some areas where Singapore has made very interesting progress and innovations, and also suggesting that this is an area where collaboration could be effected across Southeast Asia and with South Asia. Now, we are running rather tight on schedule, so we have about 20 minutes for Q&A. I'm going to ask the floor to ask questions, but I'm going to take them in batches of maybe 3 questions at each time. Please keep your questions concise, and then we'll try to get the Minister to answer as many of these questions as possible in about 20 minutes. So can I have the first set of questions, please? Yes, I see a hand there. 1, 2, and 3. Okay, let's start with the first 3. 1, 2, and then 3, the third one at the end there. Anyone can start first. Yeah, I'll just take note.
Good afternoon, Minister. My name is Himanshu Verma. I'm from a company called Connected to India. My question is, you made a very impressive presentation on how the government is preparing for the climate change and not big efforts being done by some of the larger countries. What can citizens play, what role can citizens play in joining the government and bringing about this change and towards climate change?
Great question. Over there? No, I think the one at the back, the hands up, yeah.
Good afternoon, Minister. Thank you for the very exciting presentation. You mentioned the 5G, and there's a lot of excitement about 5G. I work in the area of technology. My name is Siddharth, and I work with a Singapore company called Playware. There have been also a lot of concerns about security issues with 5G networks. And since Singapore is not going to be making its own network technologies, we are going to be buying and importing these network technologies. What are some of the things that we have to kind of look out for in terms of adopting 5G?
Thank you. There's a question here. Yeah. Here, this row, 4th row. Yeah.
Thank you very much. And I'm Anne Lockhoff from UNDP, so we're a great partner of Singapore government in smart cities. You touched on urban tech, and I particularly wanted to know how you were encouraging startups to actually contribute towards smart cities, and then encouraging those startups to adapt technologies that can also go into developing countries. And that's purely on a selfish level from a UNDP perspective asking that question. Thank you.
Thank you. So, Minister, 3 questions. How can citizens play a bigger role? 5G and security, and urban tech and startups.
Thank you. Thank you for those questions. Climate change and what role citizens can play, I think all of us will have to play an important role in tackling climate change. And it starts with the recognition that this is not cost-free. It costs us something. To put it in perspective, in order to achieve the targets that we want to prevent global temperatures from rising beyond safe levels by 2050, the global economy essentially has to decarbonize at a rate that's 10 times faster than what it is today. Renewable power will probably need to be about 60% of global energy consumption compared to just 10% in the world today. And importantly, there needs to be a price of carbon, right? All of us will have to pay for it, and that's probably about $70 per ton of carbon compared to virtually nothing today in many countries in the world, right? So that is the hard part. Right? It's very nice to say, let's all do our part, let's do the easy things. This is where the rubber hits the road. It is difficult. It entails cost. And I think it begins with this recognition that it entails costs, and countries will all have to grapple with this. And that's the reason why it's not so easy to make progress, because I don't think every single country has come to terms with it. So we try our very best. I think citizens can do their part too. But I think this recognition of the growing gap is one reason why we see young people becoming more radical in their activism on climate change. Because they honestly see the gap growing and they don't see any ready answers. And I can understand why. It is worrying. Right? So I think it is something all of us should consider very carefully and think very hard about, and in our respective roles as corporate leaders, corporates certainly can do a lot more to champion sustainability standards. Governments everywhere should do so, and citizens can do their part by encouraging their respective governments to do more. And in Singapore, we will do whatever we can, as I've highlighted, and we are committed to doing our part in a small way, when you look at the global picture, but whatever we do hopefully can also help to motivate and influence others to join this journey. Because I think it is truly one of humanity's biggest challenges. 5G security, it is a concern, but let's put it in perspective. There is no network today that is completely foolproof. I mean, any network that you buy from any country is potentially will have some concerns, right? So if the objective is to achieve a completely foolproof security, non-hackable network, then you have to sort of, live on a separate network and live on a separate planet, right? It's not possible. So what we will do when we go about our 5G process is to basically, first of all, we are doing it as a standalone network, meaning to say it's separate from the existing 4G, which means that we have the chance to build from scratch, and we are not dependent on existing 4G, or for that matter, encumbered by whatever the drawbacks that exist in the existing 4G network. So it's standalone. We will specify a certain security requirement that is best in class, and then we will put it out for companies to bid for it and to put out their proposals, and we will choose those that meet our robust security standards. I think that's as best as we can achieve. And then on the question from UNDP on startups, we are encouraging startups. It is taking a bit longer. If you look at the startup scene for urban tech, particularly within the built environment, this is happening globally. It's taking a bit longer than startups in other fields, because with the built environment, you have a lot more capital outlay, right? A startup in fintech, you can come in, you can disrupt the banks with an online solution. In the built environment, what are you going to do? You still need capital expenditures to build the building. So the disruption has been a bit slow, and the startups find it hard to gain traction. So we are putting in place incubator spaces, accelerator spaces for startups to grow, but we importantly are also trying to get startups to be paired with developers. Because that's the key, I think, where if the developers come on board, the existing developers are the ones with the capital. They are the ones that finance and own the projects. And if the developers say, these are my challenges, these are the problem statements that I face today, right? And the startups offer solutions, then the developers would have an interest in engaging the startups and making use of the solutions that the startups offer in their projects. So we are putting in place these matchmaking platforms where developers, then the main contractors, the main construction companies, the big ones, can meet with the startups, and then you can have a possibility of them coming together, embracing some of these solutions, and then initiating them or rolling them out in their projects. So that's starting. We are seeing some positive results, and if these go well, then hopefully some of these startups can use Singapore as a base. After having deployed in Singapore, can go beyond Singapore to export the solutions overseas as well.
Okay, can we have the next set of questions? Probably the last set because we're running out of time. Please, the lady in front here. Isha, yeah.
Mr. Minister, my question, first just a comment that you were talking about solar panels and shortage of space. So have you considered floating panels as well?
Yes,
The question is that, you know, when we talk about resilient cities, we're seeing a lot of outmigration from the rural areas to the cities because the pull factor is very strong. Should we not also be at the same time talking about building resilience of the communities at the village level to prevent this from happening? And my second question is that we're constantly talking about innovation and technology to keep pace with climate change. Should we not also be thinking about changing our production and consumption behavior patterns to try to address this at the same level?
Thank you. Other questions? If not, I'll invite the Minister to answer this one first.
Yeah. I agree with you. So just to clarify, I mentioned floating solar panels just now. When I talk about solar panels on the reservoirs and offshore, those are indeed floating solar panels. In fact, the potential for solar panels goes beyond horizontal solar panels and floating solar panels. We are now also piloting vertical solar panels, building integrated photovoltaic panels, which are integrated with the building facades vertically, right? And if you look at buildings, typically there is more vertical space than there is horizontal space. So if these vertical solar panels take off, they are still more expensive, they are not as efficient as the horizontal ones, but if they are proven to be effective, then we can scale up much more in terms of solar power in Singapore. The second point, should we not change our production and consumption habits? Completely agree. But it is fundamentally challenging, and I explained this, why it is challenging globally. If you look at take the world's population, about 80% of the world today have not experienced flying a plane. That's a lot. All of us who have traveled on the planes think we are the mainstream. We are 20%. 80% of the world have not traveled on planes before. And look at how pollutive and energy intensive plane travel is today, right? Are we then going to say to the 80% of the world, thou shall never have a chance to travel on a plane? Because all of them aspire to travel. All of them aspire to travel, and I can understand why. And so this is why tackling global warming is fundamentally challenging. Many people in the developing world say, this is not, our people have a right to aspire towards better life, to aspire to travel, to aspire to grow, all of which are carbon intensive, right? And you in the developed countries have to do something to help us. And the developed countries are saying, well, yeah, but we are stretched. We are not growing as fast as we used to be. And the sacrifices that are needed will cause a huge burden on our peoples at a time when income is stagnating, income inequality is rising, and all of us are under tremendous pressures. So this is why it is actually very challenging. I agree we should try and find good solutions. Some of them will take time, but universally everyone wants a better life in the world, right? So changing production, changing consumption habits are important, but that's why I go back to my earlier point. It requires some sacrifice to change production habits, to change consumption habits. It will require some sacrifice, and that sacrifice will be required from both developed and developing countries. And politicians, political leaders, there need to be upfront and honest with their people in terms of what the cost entails. We've tried to do some difficult things in Singapore already. We have put in place a carbon tax. Not very popular, but we have done it. And we are going to raise the carbon tax from now to 2030, right? Again, not very popular, but we have done it, right? Very few countries have done it. I wish other countries would join us in doing so. Because, mind you, like I said, our carbon tax today is just $5. We are going to raise it to maybe $10, $15, but it needs the worldwide, the carbon price needs to get to $70 at some stage when we're nowhere near there, right? So that's the difficulty with tackling climate change. It requires sacrifices from all of us, and I think we need to come to terms with it. Whether it's a developed country or developing country, coming to terms with the price that we have to pay, but also the changes in mindsets and habits that all of us will have to adjust to.
Any final question for the Minister? If not, can I abuse my position as chair and ask you a question, Minister? Many of my students talk to me, as you said, young people very concerned about this climate change. And one of the questions they keep asking is, how dependent is Singapore on fossil fuel? And how fast can we get to a stage where we can get to a fossil-free kind of energy? You mentioned solarization. Is this a very long-term kind of thing, or are we actually moving in the right direction and we're going to see significant changes soon?
Again, I think it is, we will try everything we can to try and reduce our carbon emissions. Today, we have already moved almost all of our electricity and power is produced from natural gas. It is fossil fuel, but it is the cleanest of fossil fuels. That's the saving grace. No matter how we try, how much we ramp up on solar power, it will only be a fraction of the amount of power that is generated, because solar power is just not going to, be able to be the mainstream base load power, because you can't get solar power at night. It's only certain times of the day. So I think the likelihood of us being able to move completely away from natural gas is going to be quite challenging. That's the reality. But again, does it mean we have no other options to green our island? So really, the answer should be, let's not look at individual silos. You got to look at the whole system. You got to look at the total emissions in totality overall, and then see what meaningful steps can be made. As I said, we are already able to achieve peak emissions by 2030. If you pull together all the things that we can do around buildings, around transportation, around industries, and making industries more energy efficient, that's already a major step. On top of having a national-wide carbon price, so that with that price signal, every consumer starts changing their habits, starts to be more prudent when they use energy. And then I think that's a 2030 target. By 2050, we want to be more ambitious. We want to bring down our absolute level of emissions. How far down, we are now in the process of studying, but it would require major new solutions, potentially looking at greening our transportation system in a much more significant way. We can start with our taxi fleets, our bus fleets, make them green. We can start looking at the next frontier of green buildings, as I mentioned, so that we go beyond today's green mark status. We set more ambitious targets. We probably will need a much higher level of carbon price, as I alluded to already, right? Globally, the world needs to. We will, again, set the benchmark and try our best to push on that front. And then if you pull together, perhaps even the possibility of new solutions. So we are putting R&D monies into projects like carbon capture and storage and green hydrogen, right? Using hydrogen, but green hydrogen, right? So it's cleaner. And so if some of these new technologies take off, not immediately, but over the next 20, 30 years, then I think by 2050, we have a chance of pushing the boundaries and achieving more ambitious targets, which we are determined to do. But I go back to my basic point. We can be zero carbon, but we are 0.1% of global emissions. 0.1%, just remember that, right? So we can all stop breathing in Singapore, and we can stop producing carbon, it's not going to make an impact on what's happening around the world. Of course, all the things we do, to the extent that it helps with regional collaboration, with regional influence, and motivates other countries to do something, I think that is already useful, and that's why we are motivated to do our part and be a leader on green standards. But we can't influence what other countries do. We hope for the very best. We wish for the very best, even in discussions on climate change. In the climate change meetings, we try to do our best to persuade other countries to come on board. But in the end, countries are sovereign. They have to decide on their own targets, on their own trajectory for development. And at the end of the day, if you go on today's trajectory, to be realistic, think that the likelihood of global warming happening is quite real, and therefore we think we should put in place steps to protect ourselves, and hence the significant investments we are putting in place in infrastructure to make sure that we are protected from rising sea levels. We wish we don't have to make that kind of an investment, but given the way things are in the world, I think it's probably better to be safe than sorry.
Thank you, Minister. I hope Singapore can show the way. I'm afraid that's all the time we have for this interactive session. There's going to be another panel discussion of very distinguished experts, so please stay behind and listen to the panel. But please join me now in thanking the Minister for his time and for his insights.